My name is Nadine Archer. I am 43 years old, and for 11 years, I ran a bakery that everyone in Cloverfield, Georgia, called Margaret's. Margaret was my mother-in-law. She had never baked a loaf of bread in her life. The bakery was mine. Every recipe, every early morning, every burn on my forearm from the oven rack, every Saturday when I arrived at 4 and did not leave until 2 in the afternoon. The lease was in my name. The health permits were in my name. The commercial mixer I bought second-hand from a restaurant in Savannah and drove home in a borrowed truck was paid for with 11 years of my own savings from before the marriage. But the name above the door was hers, not because she asked for it, because I gave it to her. In the specific way that women who grow up needing to be accepted by the families they marry into give things, quietly, generously, in the hope that generosity will eventually become belonging. It never did. What it became instead was something I did not have a word for until my daughter found it in a conversation with her grandmother on a Sunday afternoon in October, a conversation I was not meant to hear, in a kitchen that smelled like the cinnamon rolls I had been making since 5 that morning. The word was convenient. My mother-in-law said, in a voice that carried through the wall, with the particular ease of someone who has never fully imagined that the person they are describing might be present. Nadine has always been convenient. She works hard, and she doesn't make a fuss, and she keeps the name because it brings in business. It's an arrangement that works for everyone. An arrangement. 11 years. 11 years of 4 in the morning, and flour-dusted aprons and customers who drove 40 minutes each way every Saturday for something I had made with my own hands. 11 years of teaching 3 employees everything they knew about pastry and dough and the particular patience that baking requires. 11 years of filling a space I had built and decorated and kept alive through 2 economic downturns and a global pandemic that had nearly ended everything. An arrangement that works for everyone. I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen door with a dish towel in my hand. My daughter Patience, who was 15, was sitting at the kitchen table across from her grandmother Ruth. Ruth did not know I was there. Patience did not know I was there. I stood in the hallway, and I heard every word, and I made a decision so quietly that the only sound it made was the dish towel dropping from my hand to the floor. Before I take you inside that bakery, and inside that marriage, and inside the 11 years that preceded that hallway moment, please like this video, and subscribe to Silent Will Stories. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight, I especially need to know who is at the table with me. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not to the hallway. To a Friday evening in late September, 22 years ago. To a county fair in Cloverfield, Georgia. To a booth where a 21-year-old woman was selling baked goods she had made herself. And to the specific quality of attention from a young man named Daniel Archer, who tasted a piece of peach pound cake and looked at her like she had just done something remarkable. Cloverfield. Georgia sits between 2 larger towns and has always existed in the comfortable obscurity of a place that people drive through rather than to. Main Street has a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner that has been there since 1962, a church on either end, and the particular atmospheric quality of a community that has been the same size for 40 years and expects to remain so. I grew up in Cloverfield. My mother, Delphine Archer, before she was my mother-in-law, was a woman who had come to Cloverfield from Macon at 25, married a farmer named Gerald Archer, raised 3 children on that farm, and become, over 3 decades, the kind of woman that small towns produce when a capable and opinionated person has enough time and enough community to perfect both qualities. My own mother, Dorothy Price, was the pharmacist on Main Street. My father, Calvin Price, taught high school biology and coached track. We were not wealthy and not poor, the particular middle-class steadiness of professional people in a small town, and I grew up in a house where work was valued and quality was expected, and nobody discussed money at the dinner table, but everyone understood how it worked. I started baking when I was 8. Not from a kit, not from a box. My grandmother, Lena, my mother's mother, had been a baker in the way that some women of her generation were bakers, not as a hobby, not as a career aspiration, but as a fundamental life skill that she treated with the seriousness it deserved. She made everything from memory and feel. She measured flour by the weight of it in her palm. She knew when bread dough was right by the resistance it offered her hands. She did not use timers. She used her nose. She said to me once, standing at her kitchen counter in the house on Pecan Street, where she had lived for 40 years, while I stood beside her watching her hands work a piece of pastry dough with a competence I found almost frightening. Nadine, baking is a conversation. You ask the dough a question with your hands, and it tells you what it needs. You have to be quiet enough to hear the answer. I have been baking since I was 8 years old, and I have never forgotten that sentence. I made my first full pie at 9, my first bread at 11. By 14, I was responsible for most of the baking in our house, because I was better at it than my mother and my mother, who was not a woman who had difficulty acknowledging facts, said so plainly, and stepped back. By the time I was 21, I had been baking seriously for 13 years. I had a notebook of recipes, some my grandmother's, some developed through my own years of experimentation, written in the careful handwriting I used for things that mattered. I had a theory about sourdough that I had spent 4 years testing. I had opinions about the specific way that Georgia summer heat affected yeast activity that were informed by actual experience rather than any book. What I did not have was a business, or a plan, or anyone who had told me that what I was doing on Friday evenings and Sunday mornings in my mother's kitchen was worth building a life on. Then Daniel Archer tasted the peach pound cake. Daniel was the second of Gerald and Ruth Archer's 3 children. He was 23 when I met him, 6'2", the kind of broad-shouldered quiet that some men carry easily, and possessed of the particular unhurried attention that I would eventually learn was not his natural disposition, but a manner he had cultivated from watching his father. He worked on the family farm. He did not love farming the way his older brother James did, with a kind of bodily commitment that required no justification. He did it because it was what Archers did, and because not doing it would have required a conversation with his father that he had not yet decided he was willing to have. He tasted the pound cake at the county fair, and he stopped. That is the specific thing I remember. Every other person who had come to that booth had tasted and moved on, the way people move through county fairs, the perpetual forward motion of the crowd. Daniel tasted it and stopped. He said, "Did you make this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What's in it?" I told him. He said, "Can I buy a whole one?" We talked for 40 minutes at that booth. He came back the following Saturday with his sister Caroline to buy another cake, and we talked for another hour. By November, we were seeing each other with the specific frequency of two people who have found something in each other that they were not anticipating and are being careful with it. I loved Daniel Archer for many real reasons. His steadiness, his humor, which was dry and arrived late, and was funnier for the waiting. His genuine interest in what I was doing and making, which was not performance, but the actual attention of someone who finds a particular kind of capability genuinely fascinating to be around. I also loved him in the way that young women sometimes love men from established families, with an admixture of genuine feeling and the particular appeal of being chosen by someone whose belonging seemed effortless. The Archers belonged to Cloverfield in a way the Prices did not quite. Not because we were newcomers. My mother had been on Main Street for 20 years by then, but because belonging is sometimes about duration and sometimes about something else entirely, something harder to name, and the Archers had that something else. I wanted it. I am honest enough about this. What I did not fully understand when I married Daniel at 24 was that wanting to belong to a family and belonging to it are not the same thing, and that the way I would spend the next 2 decades trying to close that gap would cost me something I have only recently been able to fully name. Ruth Archer was a significant woman. I want to give her that, because giving the people in our stories only their failures is not the same as telling the truth about them. Ruth was organized, community-minded, and possessed of a genuine warmth that was not performative. She ran the church auxiliary for 15 years. She organized the town's annual Heritage Festival for a decade. She knew everyone's name in Cloverfield and the names of their children, and she asked after the children by name, which is a skill that sounds small and is not. She was also a woman who had spent 40 years as the center of something: her household, her community, her church, and who related to the people around her in the unconscious way of people who are accustomed to being at the center of things, not cruelly, not deliberately, simply as the natural assumption of someone for whom centrality has been so long established that it is no longer a position but an atmosphere. When Daniel brought me home, Ruth was welcoming, genuinely so. She hugged me with the warmth of a woman who likes people, and who liked me specifically. She included me in family events. She taught me a recipe for her grandmother's cornbread dressing that she had not shared with her daughters-in-law before me, which she presented as a significant gesture, and which I received as one. What Ruth could not quite do, and what I understand now she was never fully required to examine, was see me as anything other than what I had come into the family as. I had come in as Daniel's wife, as the young woman from the pharmacy family who had a hobby with baking. That was the frame. And the frame, once established, is very difficult to revise inside a family that has been telling itself the same stories about the same people for 30 years. The bakery began in my 32nd year. Patience was 2. Daniel had finally left the farm. In the conversation with his father, he had been postponing for a decade, which turned out to be a conversation his father received with more grace than Daniel had expected, and was working in equipment sales, which suited him far better than farming had. I had been baking seriously, commercially, at farmers' markets and for private orders, for 4 years at that point. I had a customer list. I had a reputation in the county, that was built on the specific, real quality of the thing I made. I had saved, carefully, over those 4 years, and before them, a total of $28,000. Not a fortune. Enough for a serious beginning. There was a space available on a side street off Main, a former sandwich shop that had closed during the recession. Small, with a kitchen that needed work and a storefront that needed more. But the bones were right, and the rent was possible, and the location, 1 block from the hardware store and 2 from the diner, meant foot traffic from people who were already in town. I leased it in March. I renovated it through April and May, with the help of my father, who came every weekend, and who worked with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent 40 years doing things properly, and my friend Bettina Crawford, who was an interior designer in Savannah, and who drove up 3 weekends to help with the front space, because she said it was the most interesting project she had been offered all year. I opened in June. I named it Nadine's. For 3 weeks, it was Nadine's. Then Ruth mentioned at a Sunday dinner that she thought it was such a shame the bakery didn't have a warmer name, something that felt like family, something that made people feel at home. She said it the way a person says something they have been thinking about, but would never actually ask for. The way that makes the person across the table feel that agreeing is a gift they are giving, rather than something they are having extracted from them. I looked at Daniel. He looked at his plate. I said, "What did you have in mind?" She said, "Well, I always thought Margaret's had a lovely ring to it. My grandmother's name. It always made me think of a warm kitchen. Margaret, her grandmother, a woman I had never met, who had nothing to do with the recipes in my notebook, or the sourdough theory I had developed over 4 years, or the $28,000 I had saved, or any single morning I had stood in that kitchen." I said, "That's a lovely idea, Ruth." The sign went up the following week. Margaret's Bakery, Cloverfield, Georgia. I told myself it was a small thing. I told myself what I always told myself in those years, which was that being generous was how you built belonging. And belonging was what I was working toward. And eventually, the 2 things would arrive together, and the small things would not matter anymore. I believed that for 11 years. Let me tell you what 11 years of Margaret's Bakery built in actual, specific, measurable terms. Because I am a woman who spent those 11 years managing every number the business produced, and I know them precisely. By year 3, we had 3 full-time employees and revenue of $112,000 annually. By year 5, we were a destination. People drove from 2 counties away for the sourdough and the peach pound cake and the cinnamon rolls that had a waiting list for holiday orders from September onward. By year 7, we had been featured in a regional magazine's Best of Georgia issue, and the article had used the phrase, "simply the finest baking in the Southeast region," and the article had my photograph in it, and the name in the photograph's caption was not mine. The caption said, "Margaret's Bakery, operated by the Archer family." I am the Archer family who operated it. Every morning, every recipe, every decision, Daniel helped occasionally, the way that partners help when they are supportive without being essential. He moved boxes. He fixed things. He showed up on Saturdays during the holiday rush and ran the register with genuine goodwill. He was a good husband and a real presence, and the bakery would have been exactly the same without him, which is not a criticism of Daniel, but an honest accounting. By year 9, the bakery was generating $230,000 annually. I had expanded into the space next door. I had hired 2 more employees. I had developed a small wholesale account with 2 restaurants in Savannah who served my bread and put it on their menus with the name of the bakery. One of the menus said, "Bread, sourced from Margaret's, Cloverfield." This menu was photographed and put on the restaurant's website. The photograph was there for 4 years. I am Nadine. My name was nowhere. By year 11, I understood clearly that what I had built was significant and real and mine. I understood it in the way you understand things that you know, but have not yet decided what to do with. The knowing sat in me like a stone in a river, constant, heavy, shaped by the water flowing around it, but not dissolved by it. The business was mine. The name was not. And I had given the name so long ago, and so willingly, that taking it back would require a conversation I had been postponing, in the same way Daniel had once postponed the conversation with his father. For years, because it required me to say something true that would rearrange something established. Then, I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen door, and Ruth said convenient, and the stone in the river stopped being something I was flowing around. I want to tell you about grandmother Lena before I tell you about what happened next, because she is the reason I had the strength to do what I did, and because she did not live to see it, and deserved to, and because the things she gave me are the most important inheritance I have ever received. Lena Price died at 87 when I was 35. She was sharp and specific until the last year, when she softened in the way that very old people sometimes soften, as if the edges that have been useful for a lifetime become at the end unnecessary weight to carry. She came to the bakery once. She lived 2 hours away, and she was 83 at the time, and she came with my mother on a Saturday morning in late October, when the light in Georgia is the best it gets all year, low and golden, the particular autumn light of a place that does not have dramatic fall foliage, but compensates with warmth. She walked in, and she looked around the space. She looked at the cases, and the bread on the cooling racks, and the 3 employees moving in the choreography of a kitchen that knows itself. She stood in the middle of the floor for a long moment, and she breathed in. She said, "I can smell you in this room." I said, "Grandma." She said, "I mean it. Every baker leaves something of themselves in the bread." After a while, the room carries it. "You're all through this room, Nadine." Then she looked at the name above the door. She said, "Who is Margaret?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. She had the particular economy of the very old with their responses, the understanding that words cost something and should be spent accordingly. She said, "And what does Margaret think of this room?" "She thinks it's lovely," I said. "She doesn't bake." Lena looked at me with the eyes of a woman who had been watching people make decisions for 83 years, and who had developed over that time a very accurate sense of which decisions were made from strength and which from fear. She said, "Nadine, baking is a conversation. You taught yourself that. This room is the conversation. Your name should be in it." Then she sat down at one of the small tables by the window and ordered a cinnamon roll and a coffee, and ate the cinnamon roll with the focused attention of a woman giving something the full credit it deserved. She died 2 years later. She left me 3 things: her cast iron skillet, her recipe book, a notebook not unlike my own, with the same quality of handwriting that treats its subject with respect. And a letter, 3 pages, written in the last year when the writing had become slightly larger and less certain, but the thinking had not. I have read that letter many times. The part I come back to most is near the end. She wrote, "You have your grandmother's hands, Nadine. Hands that know what they're doing before the head catches up. Don't let anyone else put their name on what your hands have made. Not from anger. Just from the simple, honest truth of it. It is yours. That is enough reason. It is yours. That is enough reason." I kept that letter in the bottom of my apron pocket for 3 years before I was ready to use it. The Sunday afternoon in October when I stood in the hallway and heard Ruth say convenient, I was 38 years old. Patience was 15. Daniel and I had been married for 14 years, in the way that a marriage becomes in its middle years, a shared life, rather than a chosen one. Not unhappy, not unfulfilling, simply layered with everything that 14 years accumulates, the good and the complicated together, inseparable. Daniel had come home at 2 that afternoon. Ruth had arrived at 3 for what she called a quick visit, which in Ruth's vocabulary meant 2 to 3 hours and a full inventory of the household's current state. She had a gift for the casual survey, the way she could assess a room's tidiness, or the contents of a refrigerator, or the quality of the Sunday dinner preparation, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been running households longer than I had been alive. Patience had been at the kitchen table, doing homework. I had been in the bedroom folding laundry. I had heard Ruth arrive, and heard the kitchen conversation begin, and had continued folding laundry, because I had found, over 14 years, that Ruth's early visit conversations with Patience tended to be the kind that did not require my presence, and that Patience navigated with the diplomatic intelligence of a teenager who had grown up watching how things worked. I came out of the bedroom at 4:15 to start thinking about dinner. The hallway outside the kitchen is 6 feet long. The kitchen door was open. I heard Patience's voice first, asking something I did not catch. Then Ruth's voice, clear and assured, and carrying with it the particular weight of a woman who has never fully expected to be overheard, because in her experience, the people who would overhear her are not people who would challenge what they heard. She said, "Your mother has built something very nice with that bakery. She's worked very hard." There was a brief pause. I could feel Patience considering her response the way she considered things, carefully and from multiple angles. Patience said, "Do you think she'll ever put her own name on it?" Ruth said, "Oh, I doubt it. Margaret's has become the brand now. Changing it would be a business mistake. Besides, Nadine has always been convenient. She works hard, and she doesn't make a fuss, and she keeps the name because it brings in business. It's an arrangement that works for everyone." I stood in the hallway. The dish towel was in my hand. I felt something settle in me with a quietness that surprised me. I had expected, if I ever heard something like this, to feel anger. Instead, I felt something closer to clarity, the specific clarity of a thing that has been suspected for years and is finally, unambiguously, confirmed. Convenient. Not remarkable. Not talented. Not the woman who had built something worth driving 40 minutes for. Not the baker who had created the recipe for the sourdough that the Savannah restaurant put on its menu. Not the person who had shown up at 4 every morning for 11 years and made something real. convenient. I let the dish towel drop to the hallway floor. I walked into the kitchen. Ruth looked up. Her expression shifted in the particular way of someone who is calibrating how much of what they said might have been audible. It was a fast calibration, practiced, but I was watching closely enough to see it. Patience looked at me. There was a quality in my daughter's expression that I will remember for the rest of my life. Not guilt, not alarm. Something steadier and more complicated. The expression of a 15-year-old girl who has just heard something about her mother that has named something she already knew but had not had words for, and who is watching to see what her mother is going to do with it. I looked at Patience. I looked at Ruth. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, "Ruth, I heard what you said." Ruth's expression completed its calibration. She chose directness, which was to her credit even in that moment. She said, "Nadine, I didn't mean—" I said, "You meant it. Not cruelly, but you meant it." She was quiet. I said, "I want to tell you something, not because I'm angry, because I think you deserve to know what convenient has actually cost." Patience put down her pencil. Ruth folded her hands on the table. And I told them both the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. But the beginning of it. I want to pause here because I know this is the moment you have been waiting for, and I need to tell it carefully. I did not raise my voice. I did not list grievances in the way of a person who has been storing them for 11 years and has finally found permission to release them all at once. I am not that kind of person by temperament, and I have found, in my experience with bread and with people, that what arrives too fast and too hard tends to destroy the texture of what you are working with. I said, "The bakery is mine, not in a legal technicality way, in the actual, essential, foundational way. Every recipe in that building came from my notebook. Every morning started with my alarm going off at 3:45. Every loan application I signed, every health inspection I prepared for, every employee I hired and trained, and in some cases let go when I had to. Every customer relationship that exists in Cloverfield because a person came in once and found something that made them come back. That is mine." Ruth said, "I know you've worked very hard, Nadine." I said, "It's not about working hard. Working hard is what gets you through the week. What I'm describing is authorship. The bakery is mine the way a painting is the painter's. Not because I own the canvas. Because I am the whole of what's in it." Ruth was quiet. She had the look of a woman encountering a conversation she had not anticipated and was trying to find the right posture for. She said, "The name brings continuity. Customers know Margaret's." I said, "Customers come for the bread. I have been making the bread. If I put my own name above the door tomorrow, every single one of them would come back the following Saturday because they are coming for what I make, not for a name they associate with your grandmother, who never set foot in that kitchen." Ruth flinched. Slightly. "Enough," I said. "I'm not telling you this to be hurtful. I'm telling you this because you sat at this table and called me convenient, and convenient is not what I am. I am the baker. I am the owner. I am the person who built something real in a building that now has someone else's grandmother's name above the door, and has had it for 11 years, because I thought generosity would eventually become belonging." Ruth said, "You do belong to this family." I said, "I know you believe that, and I know you mean it, but belonging that arrives on your terms, in the frame you've decided for me, is not the same thing as being seen. And I am done being in a frame someone else decided on." Patience was watching me. She had not moved since I started speaking. Her pencil was on the table in front of her. She was watching with the full attention of a person who is witnessing something they will remember for a very long time. I looked at her. I said, "This is what it looks like when you stop letting people decide what you are." Then I stood up. I picked up the dish towel I had brought in from the hallway. I folded it on the counter edge. And I said, "I think I'm going to go check on the starter. I have bread to set this evening." I went to my bakery. Not Ruth's grandmother's bakery. Mine. I need to tell you about Daniel's role in what came next, because a story about a marriage requires honesty about the marriage, and the honest version of Daniel is not simple. Daniel was not a bad husband. He was not complicit in Ruth's characterization of me in any deliberate sense. He was a man who had grown up inside a family that told a particular story about itself and about the people in it, and he had absorbed that story the way children absorb things, not with agreement or disagreement, but with the simple acceptance of something that is always present and therefore invisible. He had not pushed back when the name changed to Margaret's 11 years before. He had not pushed back at any of the subsequent moments when the story being told about the bakery did not include my full authorship. Not because he didn't know the truth, because the truth was something he knew the way you know something that does not yet require action. When I came home that Sunday evening from the bakery, Daniel was in the living room reading. He looked up. He saw something in my face. He said, "What happened?" I sat down on the other end of the couch and told him about the hallway and what Ruth had said and what I had said in the kitchen after. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I should have said something a long time ago." I said, "Yes," he said, "about the name, about the way she talks about the bakery, about the way she takes credit for." He stopped. I said, "Finish it." He said, "The way she takes credit for things she had nothing to do with building." "Yes," I said. He said, "I let it go because it felt like a family thing, like my mother having a connection to something. It seemed harmless." I said, "It wasn't harmless. It cost me 11 years of being described as an arrangement instead of an author." He looked at me. He said, "I know." Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to change the name." He said, "Okay." I said, "I want to have an honest conversation with your mother about what the bakery actually is and who actually built it, and I want that conversation to be permanent. I don't want to have it and then slide back into the same arrangement because it's easier." He said, "Okay." I said, "I need to know if you're with me on that." He looked at me for a long moment, the look of a man who has reached the place where what he knows and what he has been doing have to stop being different things. He said, "I'm with you. I should have been with you 11 years ago. I'm sorry it took this long. It was not a perfect apology. It did not restore 11 years. But it was honest, and it was his, and I received it without reservation, because that is what you do with honesty when it arrives. Even late, I called my friend Bettina on a Monday morning. Bettina Crawford had been my friend since we were in the same summer program at 17, and had been bonded by the shared experience of being the only two people in the program who had read the same obscure novel and wanted to discuss it. She was now a successful interior designer in Savannah, and she was also, which was more relevant to the present situation, a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence and a deep commitment to what she called getting things right. I told her everything: the hallway, The word convenient. The kitchen conversation. Daniel's response. What I wanted to do. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, which for Bettina is a very long pause. Then she said, "Nadine, I helped you decorate that bakery." "I know." She said, "I painted your name on the window in chalk lettering for the opening weekend, before the sign went up. Do you remember that?" "I remembered," she said. "I always thought." She stopped. I said, "Say it." She said, "I always thought you gave that name away too fast. I thought you were trying to buy something that should have been given freely. And I didn't say it, because you seemed happy, and I didn't want to be the person who complicated your happiness." "I know," I said. She said, "I should have said something." I said, "You're saying it now." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need someone to help me think through how to change the name without destroying the customer relationships we've built. And I need someone to help me think through how to have a conversation with Ruth that doesn't blow up a 14-year marriage." She said, "I can be there Saturday." She drove from Savannah on Saturday. We sat in the bakery after closing, 2 women at a small table near the window, with the good afternoon light coming through it, and we built a plan. Not a plan for confrontation, a plan for truth. Because the distinction mattered to me enormously, as it has always mattered, and as I have always believed is the difference between burning something down and building something better. The plan had 3 parts. The first was a meeting with Ruth, not at her house, at the bakery, neutral ground, which was also my ground, and I wanted her to be inside what I had built when I told her the truth about what it was. The second was a conversation with Daniel present, not because I needed a buffer, because he had said he was with me, and I wanted that to be real in the room. The third was a business decision, made on my own, that I would announce after the family conversation, and not before, because the business decision was mine, and I did not require permission for it. I called Ruth on a Tuesday evening. I said, "Ruth, I'd like you to come to the bakery on Thursday afternoon. I want to have a conversation with you and Daniel together, about the bakery and about some changes I'm planning." There was a pause. She said, "Is everything all right?" I said, "Everything is honest, which I think is better than all right." She came on Thursday. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon, after the morning rush and before the evening prep, when the bakery was empty and quiet and smelled of everything that had been made that morning. The cooling racks still held the last of the afternoon bread. The display cases were partially cleared. The kitchen in the back was clean and waiting. Ruth walked in and looked around the way she always looked around the bakery, the proprietary sweep of someone who considers herself connected to a place. Then she looked at the walls. Because I had done something before she arrived, I had taken down the photograph that had hung in the back hallway of the bakery since year 2. The photograph was of Margaret Archer, Ruth's grandmother, a woman I had never met, whose image had been in my kitchen for 11 years, because Ruth had brought it one Sunday and hung it herself, and I had said nothing. I had replaced it with a different photograph. The photograph was of my grandmother, Lena, standing at the counter in her Pecan Street kitchen, her hands in a bowl of dough. 80 years old in the photograph, and looking at the camera with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, and has always known. Ruth looked at the photograph. She looked at me. She sat down at the table I had set for 3. Daniel sat beside her. He had come from work. He was still in his work clothes, and he sat with the particular settled posture of a man who has made a decision about which side of something he is on and is not going to waver. I sat across from them both. I said, "Ruth, I want to tell you some things about this bakery that I should have said a long time ago. I'm not saying them to relitigate what happened in my kitchen on Sunday. I'm saying them because the truth of what this place is deserves to be known by the people in my family." She said, "I'm listening." I told her. Not everything at once, in the order it had happened. The $28,000, the lease, the renovation, the recipes, the sourdough theory, the magazine article, the Savannah restaurants, the customers who drove 40 minutes, the employees I had trained, the 2 economic downturns we had navigated, and how the pandemic year when I had taken no salary for 6 months so I could keep the 3 employees I had because they had families and I could not put them out. Ruth listened. She did not interrupt. To her credit, she did not interrupt at any point. When I finished, the bakery was quiet. The afternoon light had shifted and was coming through the front windows at a lower angle, touching the display cases and the cooling racks and the photograph of Lena at her counter. Ruth said, "I knew you worked hard." I said, "Knowing someone works hard and knowing what they have built are different things, Ruth. I needed you to know what I have built." She said, "The name." I said, "The name is something I gave you. I gave it because I thought it would make me belong here faster. It didn't work that way, and I'm changing it." She said, "To what?" I said, "To what it should have been from the beginning." She looked at Daniel. He met her eyes, and did not look away, and did not offer rescue. She looked back at me. Then she said something I was not prepared for. Not an apology exactly, but something more specific, and therefore more honest than an apology. She said, "I didn't think it mattered to you." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because you never said it did." I sat with that. It was the truest thing she had said in all the years I had known her. I had never said it mattered. I had given the name and smiled. I had read the magazine caption that didn't include me and filed it away. I had heard "convenient" through a hallway wall and dropped a dish towel. I had never said it mattered because I had been taught, in the invisible way that women are taught things, that saying what matters is a different kind of cost than the cost of not saying it, and that the second cost is always worth paying to keep the peace. I had been wrong about that for 11 years. I said, "It mattered. I'm saying so now." She nodded, slowly, the nod of a woman doing real internal work in real time, which is an uncomfortable thing to watch and a harder thing to do. She said, "I think I owe you something I'm not sure I know how to give properly." I said, "An acknowledgement of what you actually know about who built this place." She said, "You built this place." She said it simply, without performance, without the weight of someone saying something they don't mean. She said it the way it was true. I said, "Thank you." That was the conversation. It was not dramatic. It did not resolve everything. There are things between Ruth and me that are still being worked through, and there are things that may never be fully repaired, because 11 years of an unequal arrangement leaves a residue that honest conversation can acknowledge, but not fully dissolve. But the truth had been said, and the truth, once said, changes the shape of things permanently. Even when nothing else immediately changes, the shape is different, because everyone in the room now knows what is true, and knowing it makes the old arrangements impossible to maintain without conscious choice. The sign came down on a Saturday morning in November. I did it myself. I had borrowed a ladder from my father, who had come to help the way he came to help everything, methodically, without drama, with the particular pleasure of a man who likes being useful to his daughter. The name Margaret's was on a hand-painted wooden sign that had been there for 11 years. The paint had weathered and faded at the edges, the way outdoor signs do in Georgia summers. It had a kind of beauty in its weathering that I had always appreciated without wanting it to be mine. I took it down carefully. I set it against the exterior wall. Then I brought out the new sign. Bettina had made it. She had driven from Savannah again, the second time in 3 weeks, because she said she needed to see the beginning of this with her own eyes. The new sign was painted in the same style as the original, hand-lettered, clean. Dark green background, cream lettering. It said, "Nadine's Bakery." My father held the ladder. Bettina stood back to direct the leveling. Daniel stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching with the expression of a man who is seeing something be put right, and feeling the specific quality of relief that comes when that happens. Patience was there. She had come on her bicycle and was standing with it at the curb, still in her coat, her hair loose in the November wind. She watched the sign go up with the full attention she brings to things she considers important. When it was level and in place, I stepped back and looked at it. Nadine's Bakery. My name. Above the door I had walked through 11 years of 4 in the morning. Above the kitchen where every recipe had come from my hands. Above the space where my grandmother Lena's photograph now hung on the wall. My name. Patience said, "Mom." I turned around. She was smiling, not the easy smile of every day, the full one, the one that she saves for things that genuinely move her, the smile that looks like my grandmother around the eyes. She said, "It looks right." "It does," I said. She said, "It looked wrong before. I always thought it looked wrong. I just didn't know how to say that." I walked over and put my arm around her. I said, "You knew how to ask the right question." She said, "What question?" I said, "On the drive home from school in September. You asked me once why the bakery had a different name than my name. Do you remember?" She thought about it. She said, "I remember you said it was a long story." I said, "It was. This is the end of it. Let me tell you about the Saturday 3 weeks after the sign went up. It was a regular Saturday. 4 in the morning start. Bread in by 5:30. Cases filled by 7. Doors open at 7:30. The first customer through the door was Walter Gaines, who had been coming to the bakery every Saturday for 8 years, and who bought the same 2 sourdough loaves and the same 4 cinnamon rolls for his household, and who had, in 8 years, never once been late. He came in. He looked at the sign. He looked at me. He said, "Different name." "Yes," I said. He said, "Same bread?" "Same bread," I said. "Always was." He said, "Good. That's what matters." He bought his 2 loaves and his 4 cinnamon rolls. He left a $5 tip, which he had never done before, and which I believe was his way of saying something he did not have different words for. By 10 o'clock, 7 other regulars had noticed the sign and commented. The comments were variations on Walter's. Same bread. That's what matters. One woman named Cecile Harrington, who had been coming since year 1, said, "I always wondered why it was named for someone else. Seemed like it should be yours." "It is," I said. she said. Good. The following Saturday, a new customer came in. She was from 2 counties over, passing through on her way to visit family. She had seen the bakery listed online under a search for local bakeries, and had stopped on a whim. She bought a sourdough and 2 peach pound cake slices. She said, "Is Nadine here?" I said, "I'm Nadine." She said, "This bread is extraordinary. I wanted to tell whoever made it." I said, "That's me." She looked at me. Then she looked at the bakery, at the space I had built and filled and tended for 11 years. The space that now had my name above the door, and my grandmother's photograph on the wall, and my recipes in every case. She said, "You should be proud of yourself." I said, "I am." I meant it completely. It was the first time I had said those words out loud, without qualification, without the reflexive softening that says I'm just trying to do my best, or, "Oh, it's nothing really," or, "We've been very fortunate." Just, I am. Direct, and plain, and entirely true. The woman smiled and left with her bread. I went back to the kitchen. The morning was waiting, and there was work to do. There is always work to do. That has not changed. The alarm still goes off at 3:45. The oven is still the first thing I touch in the morning. The bread still takes the time it takes, and the time it takes is non-negotiable in the way that honest things are non-negotiable. What has changed is the name above the door, and the name above the door changed the shape of everything inside it. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Patience 2 months after the sign went up. Not the dramatic conversation, not the question she asked on the Sunday afternoon, or the questions she asked in the kitchen. A smaller conversation on a Wednesday evening, when we were doing dishes together after dinner. The easy, domestic rhythm of 2 people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. She said, without preamble, the way she says things that have been sitting in her mind, "Mom, what would you tell a younger version of yourself, like if you could go back?" I thought about it while I dried a plate. I said, I'd tell her that generosity given freely is a gift, but generosity given in the hope that it will eventually make someone include you is a transaction. And transactions should be named clearly when they're made, not afterward. Patience was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that what happened with the bakery?" I said, "I gave the name, thinking it would make me feel more like I belonged. It didn't. And I didn't name the transaction when I made it. I just hoped." She said, "Why didn't you just ask to belong?" I set the dried plate in the cabinet. I said, "Because asking felt like admitting I didn't already, and I didn't want to admit that." She said, "But you didn't." I said, "No, not for a long time, not in the way that means something." She said, "Do you now?" I thought about the bakery, about my name above the door, about Lena's photograph on the wall, about Walter Gaines and his 2 sourdoughs, and the new customer who had asked for Nadine and found her there. I said, "Yes, now I do." She said, "Because of the name." I said, "Because of the truth. The name is just the evidence." She nodded. She handed me another dish to dry. We went back to the easy quiet of 2 people who have said what needed saying and don't need to keep saying it. That is the specific gift of honesty when you have waited long enough for it. Not the dramatic moment, not the confrontation or the ceremony or the sign going up. The quiet Wednesday evening in the kitchen afterward, when the truth has settled into the shape of things and made them lighter to carry. This is where I have arrived. The bakery opens at 7:30 every morning except Sunday, when it opens at 8. I am there at 3:45, 6 days a week. The bread takes the time it takes. The customers come for what I have made. My name is above the door, and my grandmother's photograph is on the wall, and my notebook of recipes is in the kitchen drawer, where it has always been. Ruth and I have had 3 more conversations in the month since the kitchen table and the Thursday at the bakery. They are different conversations than the ones we had before. Not easy. More honest than easy, which is better. She came in on a Tuesday morning last month, when the bakery was quiet between the early rush and the lunch crowd. She sat at the table by the window. She ordered a coffee and a cinnamon roll. She ate the cinnamon roll the way my grandmother had once eaten one, with full attention, with the specific deliberateness of someone giving something its proper due. When she finished, she said, "Your grandmother would have liked this." I said, "She came once. She said she could smell me in the room." Ruth looked around the space. She said, "I think I understand that now." We sat quietly for a while. The November light was doing its thing with the windows and the display cases and the cooling racks. The bakery smelled like everything it always smells like. She said, "I'm sorry I used the word convenient." I said, "I know you are." She said, "I don't think that's what you are." I said, "I know you don't. Not anymore." She nodded. She said, "What do you think you are?" I thought about it. I said, "I'm the baker. I'm the owner. I'm the woman who has been having a conversation with this bread for 35 years. That's what I am." She said, "That's a good thing to be." "Yes," I said, "it is. My grandmother Lena said that baking is a conversation. You ask the dough a question with your hands, and it tells you what it needs. You have to be quiet enough to hear the answer. I have been baking for 35 years. I have been quiet enough to hear the dough. What I was not quiet enough to hear, for a long time, was myself. My own name, my own story, my own answer to the question of what I had built, and who I was inside it. It took 11 years, and a hallway, and a word spoken by someone who thought I would not hear it. It took my daughter asking a question at a kitchen table that cost her nothing and gave me everything. It took Daniel saying, "I'm with you." Finally, late, but meaning it. It took Bettina driving from Savannah twice in 3 weeks, because she said she needed to see the beginning of this with her own eyes. It took my grandmother's letter in the bottom of my apron pocket, 3 pages of handwriting that got larger near the end, saying, "It is yours. That is enough reason." And it took me, finally, believing that it was enough reason, without the generosity transaction, without the hope that giving would eventually become belonging, without the frame someone else had decided for me. It is yours. That is enough reason. Put your name on it. Not because anyone gave you permission, because it is true, and truth does not require permission. The bread knows who made it. The room carries the maker in it, and the name above the door should tell the same honest story as the bread inside. If your name belongs above a door, put it there, not in anger, not in triumph, just in the simple, quiet truth of it. It is yours. That is enough reason. It is a Thursday morning in December. The alarm went off at 3:45. The kitchen is warm. The sourdough starter has been fed and is ready, and the first loaves will go in at 5. On the wall, Grandmother Lena at her counter, her hands in the dough, 80 years old, and knowing exactly what she is doing. On the door, my name. Outside, the December dark of Cloverfield, Georgia. The particular cold clarity of a morning that has not yet been asked anything of. The bread will ask it soon enough. and I will be quiet enough to hear the answer, the way I have always been, the way I finally know to say so. Baking is a conversation. You ask the dough a question with your hands, and it tells you what it needs. You have to be quiet enough to hear the answer, and quiet enough, finally, to hear your own name in it. Thank you for being here, for staying through the whole of it. That means something I do not take for granted. If this story met you where you needed to be met, tell me in the comments. 1 word or 10. Whatever is true. If you know someone who has given their name away in the hope of belonging, share this tonight. They may be ready to hear it. Subscribe to Silent Will Stories if you haven't yet. The table is always warm, and there is always room.